Hi friends, welcome to Talevora. Today, we uncover the extraordinary life of Steve Jobs, the man who transformed the way the world communicates, works, and dreams. Before Apple became the world's most valuable company, Steve Jobs was an adopted child, a college dropout, and a young man searching for his purpose. How did he build a global empire, lose everything, and then return to change history forever? This is not just the story of a businessman. It is the unforgettable journey of vision, resilience, innovation, and one man's relentless pursuit of perfection. Let's begin. Steve Jobs was born on February 24, 1955 in San Francisco, California. But before he ever took his first step, his life had already begun with uncertainty. His biological parents were two university students who believed they were not ready to raise a child. Shortly after his birth, they made the heartbreaking decision to place him for adoption. Steve was adopted by Paul and Clara Jobs, a hard-working middle-class couple who promised they would give him a loving home and a good education. Although they were not wealthy, they surrounded Steve with love and encouraged his curiosity from a very young age. Growing up in Mountain View, California, Steve spent countless hours in the garage with his father. Paul Jobs wasn't an engineer, but he loved repairing old machines and teaching his son how things worked. Together they dismantled radios, rebuilt engines, and repaired electronics piece by piece. Without realizing it, Steve was developing the curiosity that would later change the world. Even as a child, Steve was different. He constantly questioned teachers, challenged ideas, and refused to accept things simply because others believed them. His intelligence was obvious, but so was his rebellious personality. He often became bored in school because he learned much faster than his classmates. One of his teachers noticed his exceptional abilities and encouraged him to move ahead academically. Instead of treating him like a troublemaker, she challenged him with more difficult work. That simple act changed his confidence forever. During his teenage years, Steve became fascinated by electronics. Silicon Valley was beginning to emerge around him, filled with engineers building the future. Steve attended local technology clubs where he met people who shared his passion for innovation. It was during this period that he met another young electronics enthusiast named Steve Wozniak. Wozniak was several years older but possessed extraordinary engineering skills. Steve Jobs immediately recognized his brilliance, while Wozniak admired Steve's confidence, creativity, and ability to imagine products that didn't yet exist. Their friendship quickly became one of the most important partnerships in technology history. Although they had different personalities, they complemented each other perfectly. Wozniak loved designing machines. Steve loved imagining how those machines could change people's lives. As a teenager, Steve Jobs also explored many different interests. He became fascinated by calligraphy, philosophy, music, spirituality, and design. Unlike most people who focused on one subject, Steve believed creativity came from connecting completely different ideas together. After graduating from high school, Steve enrolled at Reed College in Oregon. His parents used nearly all of their savings to pay for his education, but after only 6 months, Steve made a decision that shocked everyone. He dropped out. Many believed he had destroyed his future. Steve later explained that he couldn't justify spending his parents' life savings on classes that didn't inspire him. Instead of leaving completely, he stayed on campus unofficially, attending only the classes that interested him. One of those classes was calligraphy. At the time, it seemed completely useless. There were no computers capable of displaying beautiful typography, but Steve became fascinated by elegant fonts, spacing, balance, and visual beauty. Years later, when Apple created the Macintosh computer, those lessons became one of its greatest advantages. The Macintosh became the first personal computer with beautiful fonts and professional typography. Steve often said that if he had never attended that calligraphy class, computers might still display only plain, boring text. Sometimes, the experiences that seem meaningless become the most valuable later in life. After leaving college, Steve faced financial hardship. He had no permanent home and often slept on friends' floors. To save money, he returned empty Coca-Cola bottles for small amounts of cash. On Sundays, he walked nearly 7 miles just to receive one free meal at a local Hare Krishna temple. Life was difficult, but Steve never complained. Instead, he believed every struggle was preparing him for something greater. Around this time, Steve accepted a job at Atari, one of America's leading video game companies. Although he was talented, his unusual personality often created conflicts with co-workers. Still, his creativity impressed company leaders. Steve eventually saved enough money to travel to India in search of spiritual enlightenment. He believed success alone could never bring happiness. During several months in India, he visited temples, met spiritual teachers, and searched for deeper meaning in life. Although he returned to America without finding every answer he wanted, the journey transformed the way he thought forever. Simplicity, focus, and mindfulness became principles he would later apply to every Apple product. By the mid-1970s, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak had begun spending nearly every evening together discussing computers. At the time, computers were enormous, expensive machines used only by governments, universities, and large companies. Steve Jobs imagined something nobody else truly believed. He imagined a beautiful, affordable computer sitting inside ordinary people's homes. It sounded impossible, but sometimes history begins with an impossible dream. Steve Jobs believed that computers should not belong only to scientists or giant corporations. He wanted ordinary people to have access to technology that was simple, beautiful, and easy to use. It was a bold idea at a time when very few people even owned a computer. In 1976, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak officially founded Apple Computer. There was no luxurious office, no wealthy investors, and no massive factory. Their headquarters was the Jobs family's small garage. With determination and endless hours of work, they built the Apple I. Wozniak designed the computer, while Steve focused on selling the vision behind it. Instead of simply selling electronic parts, Steve wanted to sell an experience. The Apple I was unlike many computers available at the time. It attracted attention from computer enthusiasts, and soon the first orders began arriving. Although the profits were small, they proved one important thing: the dream could become reality. Soon afterward, Apple introduced the Apple II. This computer changed everything. Unlike earlier machines, the Apple II was designed for ordinary people, schools, and small businesses. It featured color graphics, a plastic case, and was much easier to use than competing computers. Sales exploded. Within only a few years, Apple became one of the fastest growing companies in American history. Steve Jobs was still in his 20s, yet he had already become a millionaire. But money was never his biggest motivation. Steve wanted to build products that people would truly love. As Apple continued growing, Steve became famous for his perfectionism. He expected excellence from everyone around him. Employees often described him as demanding, intense, and sometimes extremely difficult to work with. He would reject designs repeatedly until they met his incredibly high standards. Many people found working with him exhausting, but others believed his relentless pursuit of perfection pushed them to achieve things they never thought possible. Steve often repeated one simple philosophy: people don't know what they want until you show it to them. That belief shaped every major Apple product. In 1984, Apple introduced the Macintosh. It wasn't just another computer. It was revolutionary. The Macintosh featured a graphical user interface, icons, windows, and a mouse instead of complicated command lines. For the first time, using a computer felt natural. Steve also insisted that the Macintosh include beautiful typography, something inspired by the calligraphy class he had taken years earlier after dropping out of college. His seemingly useless decision had now become one of Apple's greatest strengths. The Macintosh launch became one of the most famous product presentations in history. Steve stood confidently on stage, introducing the future with excitement and passion. Audiences were amazed. However, behind the scenes, serious problems were developing. Apple was growing rapidly, and disagreements between Steve Jobs and company executives became more frequent. Steve's demanding leadership style created tension throughout the organization. In an attempt to strengthen Apple, Steve convinced John Sculley, then president of PepsiCo, to become Apple's CEO. Steve famously challenged him by saying, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to come with me and change the world?" Sculley accepted the offer. At first, their partnership seemed successful, but over time, their visions for Apple began moving in completely different directions. The board wanted stability and predictable profits. The conflict became impossible to ignore. Finally, in 1985, Apple made a shocking decision. Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple, was removed from day-to-day leadership of the very company he had built. Soon afterward, he resigned completely. Imagine creating your dream company from nothing, only to be forced out by the people now controlling it. Steve later described it as one of the most painful experiences of his life. He felt devastated. He had lost the company that defined his identity. For months, he struggled with disappointment and uncertainty. He even considered leaving the technology industry forever. Many people believed Steve Jobs' career was finished. The media described him as a brilliant visionary who had failed. Critics assumed Apple would continue succeeding without him. But what nobody realized was that this painful chapter would become the beginning of the greatest comeback in business history. Instead of giving up, Steve decided to begin again. He founded a new company called Next. Unlike Apple, Next focused on building powerful computers for universities and advanced research institutions. The products were expensive and sold in limited numbers. Commercially, Next was not a major success, but something far more important was happening. The advanced software being developed at Next would later become the foundation of Apple's future operating systems. Steve didn't know it yet. Every lesson he was learning outside Apple was preparing him for the moment he would return and change the company and the world once again. Although Next was not a huge commercial success, Steve Jobs never stopped believing in innovation. He knew that every setback carried a lesson, and every lesson brought him one step closer to something greater. Around the same time, Steve purchased a small computer graphics division from filmmaker George Lucas. Most people believed it was just another risky investment. Steve, however, saw enormous potential. He renamed the company Pixar. In the beginning, Pixar struggled financially. Years passed without major success, and many people doubted the company would survive. But Steve remained patient. He believed great ideas simply needed the right opportunity. That opportunity arrived in 1995. Pixar released Toy Story, the world's first fully computer-animated feature film. The movie became a global sensation, earning hundreds of millions of dollars and winning the hearts of audiences everywhere. Almost overnight, Pixar became one of Hollywood's biggest success stories. Steve Jobs, who had once been fired from Apple, was now leading one of the most successful animation studios in history. Meanwhile, Apple was facing serious problems. The company that Steve had founded was struggling. Sales were declining, innovation had slowed, and competitors were rapidly taking over the market. Apple desperately needed help. In 1997, something happened that few people thought was possible. Apple acquired Next. With that acquisition, Steve Jobs returned to Apple. The man who had once been forced out of his own company was now back. This time, he returned wiser, calmer, and more experienced. One of his first decisions was to simplify Apple's product lineup. Instead of producing dozens of confusing models, he focused on creating only a few exceptional products. His philosophy was simple: focus on what truly matters. Soon, Apple introduced the colorful iMac. Its unique design surprised the technology world. Unlike ordinary beige computers, the iMac looked modern, friendly, and exciting. Customers loved it. Apple's comeback had officially begun. But Steve Jobs wasn't finished. In 2001, Apple introduced the iPod. Thousands of songs could now fit inside a device small enough to fit in your pocket. It completely changed the music industry. Then came iTunes, making it easier than ever for people to purchase and organize music legally. Again, Steve Jobs had transformed an entire industry. But his biggest achievement was still ahead. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage wearing his famous black turtleneck, blue jeans, and sneakers. Smiling confidently, he announced a product that would change the world forever: the iPhone. It wasn't just another mobile phone. It combined a phone, a music player, and the internet into one elegant device with a revolutionary touchscreen. Many experts doubted it would succeed. They were wrong. The iPhone completely transformed communication. Soon after, Apple introduced the App Store, allowing millions of developers to create applications that changed the way people worked, learned, traveled, shopped, and connected. A few years later came the iPad, once again redefining personal technology. Steve Jobs had now revolutionized multiple industries: computers, music, animation, smartphones, and tablets. Yet behind the incredible success, another battle had quietly begun. In 2003, Steve was diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer. Although doctors recommended immediate treatment, Steve initially explored alternative approaches. Eventually, he underwent surgery and continued working despite his illness. Even during difficult treatments, he remained deeply involved in Apple's future. His passion for creating meaningful products never disappeared. As his health gradually declined, Steve understood that time was becoming limited. On October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs passed away at the age of just 56. The news shocked the world. Millions of people, from world leaders to ordinary Apple users, paid tribute to the man whose ideas had transformed modern life. Apple stores across the globe became places of remembrance. Flowers, candles, handwritten notes, and bitten apples were placed outside store entrances by grateful fans. Today, Steve Jobs is remembered not simply as a businessman, but as one of history's greatest innovators. His story proves that failure is never the end. He was adopted at birth. He dropped out of college. He was fired from the company he created. He faced countless doubts, criticism, and personal challenges. Yet every setback became part of the journey that eventually changed the world. Steve Jobs once said, "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life." Those words continue inspiring millions of dreamers, entrepreneurs, creators, and innovators across the globe. His life reminds us that success doesn't belong to those who never fail. It belongs to those who refuse to give up. If you enjoyed this true story, don't forget to subscribe to Talevora for more unforgettable journeys through history and inspiring real-life stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.